The morning Marcus Hale fired the entire kitchen staff. I was in the back washing the breakfast pans. I did not find out I still had a job until 4 hours later, when the head of household management came to the door of the dishwashing room and told me everyone else was gone and they were keeping me on temporarily because nobody had figured out yet what to do about the boy. The boy was 7 years old. His name was Noah, and Noah had not eaten anything in 31 hours. I want to tell you that story from the beginning, because the beginning is the part that explains everything that came after, and the beginning starts not with a billionaire, or a firing, or a hungry child, but with a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, when I was 44 years old and newly divorced, and sitting in the parking lot of the Connecticut Department of Labor, trying to figure out what a man does when the life he built has come apart, and the pieces are too small to see clearly from where he is standing. My name is Gus Reyes. I am 47 years old now. I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the second of 4 children, to parents who had come from Puerto Rico in 1974 with 2 suitcases and the specific determination of people who have decided that the life they are going to build will be built by their own hands and no other way. My father worked 31 years in a manufacturing plant in Stratford. My mother cleaned houses 6 days a week until her knees gave out when she was 62. I grew up understanding that work is not something that happens to you. Work is something you do, completely, with whatever you have, because that is what you were given and that is what you owe. I worked in restaurant kitchens from the time I was 17, not as a chef. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story. I was never a chef. I was a line cook for 12 years, a prep cook before that. And for the last 8 years before the divorce, I had been kitchen manager at a mid-sized Italian restaurant in Westport that I had helped build from a struggling family place into something genuinely good. Which I say not to brag, but because it is the context for why the divorce hit the way it did. I had put everything into that restaurant and into the marriage, and when the marriage ended, the restaurant went with it, because my ex-wife's family owned the building, and the severance conversation was brief and not particularly kind. Which is how I ended up in the parking lot of the Department of Labor at 44. Which is a specific kind of low that I would not wish on anyone and which I am telling you about, because it is what made me say yes, when the only job offered to me that month was a dishwashing position at the Hale estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate employed a full kitchen staff of 7 people, 2 chefs, 2 line cooks, a prep cook, a pastry specialist, and me, the dishwasher and general kitchen utility, which is a polite way of saying I did whatever the kitchen needed that nobody else wanted to do. The pay was modest. The hours were long. The work was the work, and I did it the way my parents had taught me to do work, which is completely, without complaint, and with whatever extra attention I could bring to it that the job didn't strictly require. I had been there 6 weeks when I first became aware of Noah. He was not a visible presence in the estate. He was 7 years old and profoundly autistic, and his world was organized around a set of routines and sensory needs that the household had built up carefully around him over years. And one of the things that was carefully managed was his exposure to new people and unfamiliar situations, which meant that most of the staff went months without seeing him directly. I became aware of him the way I become aware of most things, gradually, through accumulation of small details. The particular plates that were set aside for his meals, always the same too, white with a small blue border, never any other. The specific arrangement of food that was apparently required, items not touching each other, placed in the same positions on the plate every time. The fact that the kitchen went quiet whenever his meal was being prepared, the specific attentive quiet of people who understand that getting something wrong will matter in ways that are hard to recover from. And the food itself, which I noticed because food is what I know and the food Noah would eat was a very short list. 6 things: plain rice, specific brand, scrambled eggs cooked to a precise texture, not wet, not dry. Sliced apple, skin off, cut in 8 equal pieces. A specific brand of crackers arranged in a single row. Plain pasta with nothing on it except a small amount of butter, And one other thing, which I will come to. I learned this list not because anyone told me, because I watched the plates come back to the dishwashing station over 6 weeks, and I am a person who pays attention to food the way other people pay attention to words. The list told me something about a child who experienced the world as a place where the wrong texture, or the wrong temperature, or the wrong arrangement of things on a plate was not an inconvenience, but a genuine emergency. A violation of the predictable order that was the only thing standing between him and a sensory experience that his body could not manage. I have a daughter of my own. Her name is Sophia. She is 18 now, was 15 when all of this happened, and she is the reason I got out of bed in the parking lot of the Department of Labor and walked into the building and filled out the paperwork. Not for me, for her. Because a man whose daughter is watching can either get up or he cannot, and I decided the morning of that parking lot that I was a man who gets up. Sophia does not have autism, but she has her own particular way of being in the world that the world has not always been generous about, a combination of dyslexia and anxiety that made school a gauntlet for years and that required from me, as her father, the specific education that comes from loving a child who experiences ordinary things as hard and watching the world fail to understand why. That education is why, when I looked at Noah's plates coming back to the dishwashing station, I saw not a picky eater, but a person telling me something important about what his body needed and what happened when it didn't get it. Marcus Hale fired the kitchen staff on a Wednesday in April. I learned later that it had been a cost reduction decision made in consultation with a financial advisor who had reviewed the household budget and identified the kitchen operation as significantly over-resourced for a household that, since Noah's mother had died 2 years earlier, was primarily serving one adult and one child. The logic was not wrong on paper. The execution was what it was. 7 people let go in a single morning. I was told I was being kept on temporarily because someone needed to handle the dishwashing and basic kitchen maintenance, while the household figured out a longer-term arrangement. What nobody had figured out was that the 2 chefs who had just been let go were the 2 people who knew Noah's list, not in the general way that the household knew it, in the specific way, the precise temperature of the scrambled eggs, the exact brand of crackers, the particular way the apple slices had to be arranged on the plate, fanned, not stacked, with the narrow ends pointing toward the center. These details had been developed over 18 months of careful observation and careful failure, and they lived in the heads of those 2 chefs, and they walked out the door with them. By the time anyone realized what had been lost, Noah had not eaten in 8 hours. By the time the household manager came to my dishwashing room, it was 31. I want to tell you what happened in the 4 hours between those 2 moments, because it is important. 3 people had tried to prepare food for Noah in those 4 hours. The first was a catering service the household called in on short notice, who sent a cook who had been briefed on the list but not on the details. The plate came back untouched. The second was a private chef agency that dispatched someone within 2 hours, a skilled professional who tried twice with different preparations of the scrambled eggs. Neither plate was touched. The third attempt was made by a household staff member who had been with the estate for 12 years and genuinely loved that child and made the eggs herself from memory of watching the chefs make them. The plate was placed near Noah, who looked at it and then looked away and did not touch it. By the time the household manager knocked on my door, Marcus Hale had been told by Noah's behavioral therapist that a child like Noah, in a state of acute dysregulation caused by the disruption of routine and the wrong sensory input, could refuse food for days. She said days calmly, but the specific weight of a word that means something different when you apply it to a 7-year-old who has not eaten in 31 hours. The household manager told me this in the doorway of the dishwashing room. She said, "Mr. Reyes, I know this is outside your job description, but you've been watching those plates for 6 weeks, and I need to know if you noticed anything." I said, "Yes." She said, "Can you try?" I said, "Let me see the kitchen." Here is what I knew from 6 weeks of watching plates come back. The scrambled eggs had to be cooked in a specific pan. I had noticed because the pan always came back with a particular residue pattern that told me low heat, long time, constant movement. Not fluffy, not set. The texture of very soft curds that have been worked slowly. The crackers were a specific brand I had memorized because they came in a distinctive packaging that I had unpacked from deliveries. The apple slices had to be cut with a particular knife because the slices had always come back with the same cut edge, a sharp, clean edge, not the slightly ragged edge you get from a dull blade. And the arrangement on the plate was something I had reconstructed from the pattern of the food when it came back. The rice in the upper left, the eggs in the lower right, the apple slices fanned across the top center. The crackers in a single row along the right edge. I knew this because I am a person who looks at plates. I looked at plates for 26 years in restaurant kitchens because plates are how a kitchen tells the truth about itself, and the habit of looking never left me, even when I was on the other side of the pass. I cooked Noah's meal. It took me 40 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken, because I stopped twice to make sure the egg texture was right before I committed to it. I plated it in the pattern I had reconstructed. I handed it to the household manager. She took it to Noah's room. She came back 11 minutes later. The plate was clean, not partially eaten. Clean. Noah had eaten everything on it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me for a long moment. She said, "How did you know?" I said, "I paid attention." She said, "For 6 weeks you paid attention to a child you'd never met's dinner plates." I said, "It's what the job required." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hale would like to speak with you." I want to tell you about Marcus Hale, because he is not the villain of this story, even though it is easy to read him that way. He is a man who made a decision on paper that turned out to have consequences the paper could not show him, and when the consequences appeared, he did not double down or make excuses. He sat across from me in his study, a large room, formal, the kind of room that announces itself, and he asked me to tell him what I had noticed and how I had noticed it. I told him, all of it. The pans, the crackers, the knife edge on the apple slices, the plate arrangement reconstructed from the pattern of what came back uneaten when it was wrong. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been washing dishes here for 6 weeks." I says. He said, "And in 6 weeks you learned more about what my son needs than the household manager who has been here for 12 years. I said, "She knows things about Noah that I don't know. She knows him. I just know the plates." He looked at me. He said, "I'd like to offer you the kitchen manager position." I said, "I don't have a chef's credentials." He said, "I'm not looking for a chef. I'm looking for someone who pays attention." The pay was significant. I accepted it. I want to tell you what the next year looked like, because the job offer is not the point of this story. The point of this story is what happened in the year after between me and Noah in the kitchen of that estate, across a very large number of meals. I had accepted a position I was qualified for by experience, but had never held in this specific context, feeding a child whose relationship to food was unlike anything I had encountered in 26 years of kitchens. The 6 things on Noah's list were not the ceiling of what he could eat. They were the floor. The floor that his previous kitchen staff had carefully established over 18 months and that I now had to maintain while also figuring out whether there was anything above it. I maintained the floor for 3 months without changing anything, because the first priority was restoring stability. Noah needed to know that the plate would come the same way every time before he could consider whether there might be anything new on it. 3 months of the same plate, the same arrangement, the same temperature, the same everything. I tracked it in a notebook I kept in the kitchen. Every meal, every detail, any variation no matter how small, and what the response had been. At the end of 3 months I had 37 pages of notes on a 7-year-old's meals. Sophia came to visit me at the estate one Sunday afternoon. I showed her the notebook. She read it for a long time. She said, "Dad, this is a research document." I said, "It's a kitchen log." She said, "It's both." She was right. It was both. In month 4, I tried one addition to the plate. A small addition. A single blueberry placed at the exact center of the arrangement, not touching anything else. Not required to be eaten. Just present. Noah looked at the plate. He looked at the blueberry. He did not eat it. He ate everything else. The blueberry came back. I put one blueberry on the plate every meal for 3 weeks. It came back every time. On the 22nd day, Noah ate the blueberry. I wrote it down. I told no one for 2 days because I needed to see if it would happen again. It happened again. It happened the day after that. I went to find the household manager. I told her. She sat down. I showed her the notebook entry. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "Do you understand what this means for a child like Noah?" I said, "I think so." She said, "The therapist has been trying to expand his diet for 3 years. 3 years. And you did it with a blueberry." I said, "I did it by not forcing it. I put it there and I let him decide." She looked at me. She said, "That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the entire thing his therapists have been trying to explain to everyone around him for 3 years." I said, "I learned it from my daughter. She has anxiety." When she was 12, her therapist told me that the most counterproductive thing an anxious child's parent can do is make the thing they're afraid of into a confrontation. You put the thing in the room. You don't require it. You let them discover that it isn't dangerous on their own timeline. I never forgot it. It turned out to apply to food too. In month 7, Noah came to the kitchen. Not invited. Not brought. He came on his own. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen for a long time. I was at the counter doing prep. I did not stop what I was doing. I did not look at him directly. I said, and went back to my work. He stood there for about 4 minutes. Then he left. He came back the next day, and the next. After about 2 weeks of doorway visits, he came inside and sat on a stool at the far end of the counter. I still did not address him directly. I just worked. I narrated occasionally, not to him, just out loud, the way I had always talked in kitchens, telling the food what I was doing to it. Which is a habit from my mother, who narrated her cooking in a low, continuous voice that I absorbed as a child and never lost. After about a week of sitting on the stool, Noah said his first word to me. It was not a greeting. It was a question. He said, "Why?" I said, without looking up, "Why what?" He said, "Why does it smell different?" I said, "Because I'm using butter instead of oil today. Different fat, different smell when it gets warm." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't like oil." I said, "I know. That's why I use butter for your food." He didn't say anything else. But he stayed on the stool for the rest of the prep. Marcus Hale found out about the kitchen visits from the household manager, who found out from the security logs. He came to the kitchen one evening, after Noah was in bed. He stood at the door the way Noah stood at the door, which I did not say anything about. He said, "The manager tells me Noah has been coming to the kitchen." "Yes." He said, "Every day for 6 weeks." I said, "About that." He said, "And he talks to you?" I said, "Occasionally." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "His therapist says he hasn't voluntarily initiated conversation with anyone outside his immediate care team in 2 years." I did not say anything. He said, "What are you doing?" "I'm cooking." He said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "I know. I don't do anything. I just let him be here. I don't make it a thing. He comes, I work. If he talks, I answer. If he doesn't, I don't push." He said, "How do you know to do that?" I said, "Same way I know how to make the eggs." I paid attention. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "I have spent 2 years and more money than I am going to tell you trying to reach my son. The best specialists in the country, the best therapists. And my dishwasher reached him by making eggs and putting a blueberry on a plate." I said, "Your kitchen manager." He almost smiled. He said, "My kitchen manager." He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" He said, "For firing the staff without understanding what would be lost." I said, "You didn't know what I knew." He said, "That's the apology." I should have known. I should have asked. I should have found out what the people who work in this house know before I made a decision based on a spreadsheet. I looked at him. I said, "Yes." He nodded. "Yes. Sophia came for the summer after her junior year. She spent 3 weeks at the estate with me, helping in the kitchen, getting to know the rhythms of the place. On her second week, Noah came to the kitchen doorway while she was there. He stood and looked at her. She was at the counter helping me with prep. She did not look at him directly. She kept working. After a few minutes, she said quietly, to no one in particular, "He's got really good timing. He always comes when something smells good." Noah came inside and sat on his stool. Sophia worked beside me without making a thing of it. After about 20 minutes, Noah said, "You cut it wrong." Sophia looked at the apple she was slicing. She said, "Yeah. How should I cut it?" He showed her. She cut it his way. He said, "Better." Sophia looked at me over his head. Her expression was the expression I have been trying to describe this whole story, the one that is not surprise exactly, because Sophia has never been easily surprised. But the specific warm recognition of someone who is watching a thing she has always believed in prove itself true in front of her. She said, later that night, "Dad, he taught me something." I said, "Yes." She said, "A kid who barely talks taught me how to cut an apple." I said, "He knows things. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them." She said, "You taught me that." I said, "My mother taught me that. She taught me to be quiet in a kitchen and let the food tell you what it needs." Same principle. She looked at me. She said, "Does Mr. Hale know how lucky he is?" I said, "I think he's starting to figure it out. Marcus Hale and I have not become friends exactly. That is not the right word for what we are. We are two men who came to understand each other slowly and honestly across a year of difficult circumstances, and who have arrived at a mutual respect that does not require a name. He doubled my salary at the end of the first year, without being asked. I did not argue. He asked me what Noah would need over the next year, not what the household thought he needed, but what I had observed and recorded in the notebook that by then had grown to 4 volumes. I told him. He listened the way he had not listened at the beginning, the way a man listens when he has learned, at some cost, that the people who know things worth knowing are not always the people in the room with the most credentials. Noah is 10 now. His food list is not 6 things anymore. It is closer to 30. He still requires certain arrangements and certain textures and certain temperatures, and he probably always will, and that is not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be respected, which is a distinction that took some people around him longer to learn than others. He comes to the kitchen most mornings. He sits on his stool. He watches. Occasionally he asks questions. The questions are always specific and usually about why something works the way it works, which is a quality I recognize, because Sophia has always asked why. And in my experience, the people who ask why are the people who eventually understand things more completely than the people who only ask how. Last month, Noah told me he wants to learn to cook. Not the whole kitchen. One thing. He said, "I want to learn to make the eggs." I said, "Okay." He said, "Will you show me?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The same way you showed me the blueberry." I stopped. I looked at him. He had never referenced the blueberry before. I said, "You remember the blueberry?" He said, "I remember everything." He said it simply as a fact, the way he says most things. I believed him. "Yes. The same way I showed you the blueberry. I'll put it there. You can decide when you're ready." He nodded. He got down from the stool. He went to find his father. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. I thought about the parking lot of the Department of Labor at 44. I thought about Sophia at 15 watching me get out of the car and walk into the building. I thought about 31 pages of notes on a 7-year-old's dinner plates, and a blueberry that came back 21 times before it didn't, and a child standing in a kitchen doorway saying the word why with the particular precision of someone who intends to understand the answer. I thought about what my mother used to say about kitchens. She said, "A kitchen is not about food. A kitchen is about who you are willing to be patient for. I have spent my whole working life in kitchens. It took me 44 years and a parking lot in Bridgeport and a dishwashing job in Greenwich to understand what she meant, but I understand it now. And I am exactly where I am supposed to be. So here is what I want to ask you before you go, and I mean it as a real question. Think about the person in your life who needed you to be patient instead of useful. Who needed you to put the thing in the room and not require it? Who needed you to be quiet in the kitchen and let them tell you what they needed in their own time? Did you give them that? Or did you push? Because the pushing almost always makes it worse. And the patience almost always makes it possible. Tell me about them in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I would genuinely like to know. And if this story reached something in you today, if you believe the way I have come to believe it across 26 years of kitchens and one extraordinary year with a boy named Noah, that the most important ingredient in any room is the willingness to wait for the person in front of you to tell you what they actually need, then do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like so someone else finds their way here. Leave your story in the comments. I will see you in the next one. Trust me, it is worth staying for. I want to go back to something I skipped over, because I think it matters, and I did not give it the weight it deserved: the notebook. The 4 volumes of kitchen logs that I kept across the first year at the estate. I want to tell you what those notebooks actually were, because they look like a small thing, and they were not a small thing. Each entry was dated and timed. Each entry recorded what was prepared, how it was prepared, the temperature of the kitchen, whether there had been any change in routine that day that might affect Noah's state when the meal arrived, what the plate looked like when it left the kitchen, and what it looked like when it came back. Over 12 months, that is somewhere around 1,000 entries. 1,000 small observations about one child's relationship to food and routine and the sensory world around him. Nobody asked me to keep the notebook. It was not in the job description. It was not something the previous kitchen staff had done. I kept it because I am a person who writes things down when the work is complicated and the stakes are high, which is a habit from my years as kitchen manager in Westport, where I kept logs on everything, because a restaurant kitchen where nothing is written down is a restaurant kitchen that is one busy Saturday away from complete breakdown. The notebook was the same habit applied to a different situation. The situation happened to involve a child instead of a service, and the stakes happened to be a child's well-being instead of a restaurant's reputation, but the underlying logic was the same. Write down what you observe. Look at what you wrote. Let the pattern tell you something you could not see from inside the individual moment. Sophia read all 4 volumes during her summer visit. She read them the way she reads things she takes seriously, slowly, going back to reread certain entries. At the end she said, "Dad, this is the most detailed record of a single child's sensory needs I've ever seen outside of a clinical study." I said, "It's a kitchen log." She said, "It's both." She had said that before, about the first version. She was still right. She asked if she could make a copy. I said yes. She said she wanted to show it to one of her professors at school, who worked with children with autism and sensory processing differences. I said that was fine, but she should ask Marcus Hale first. She asked. He said yes without hesitation, and added that if the professor found it useful for anything he was happy to support that. I do not know what came of it. That part of the story belongs to Sophia and her professor, and whatever they made of a dishwasher's kitchen log. I am telling you about it because of what it represents, which is the thing I most want you to take from this story. The knowledge that helped Noah was not locked behind a credential. It was not in a textbook or a specialist training program. It was in the ordinary, careful, written down attention of a person who had decided that the work in front of him mattered, and that mattering required keeping track. I had 26 years of kitchen experience that gave me the vocabulary to understand what I was observing. But the observation itself, the looking, the writing, the going back and reading what I had written to find the pattern, that required nothing except the decision to do it. Anyone could have kept that notebook. The 2 chefs who were let go could have kept it. The household manager who had been there for 12 years could have kept it. The behavioral therapist who had been working with Noah for 3 years could have kept it. Nobody had. Not because they didn't care about Noah. They all cared about Noah. Because careful observation is slow and unglamorous and produces nothing you can point to for a long time. And in our experience, slow and unglamorous things tend not to get done, unless the person doing them has decided that the doing matters more than the pointing. I had made that decision, not consciously, not as a philosophy. As a habit, built across 26 years of kitchens and 1 parking lot in Bridgeport, and a daughter who needed me to understand that the world was harder for her than it appeared, and that the hardness required patience, not pushing. The habit was already there. Noah gave it a new place to live. Marcus Hale said something to me at the end of the first year that I have carried with me since. He said, "I need to tell you something I should have said sooner." I said, "What's that?" He said, "When I fired the kitchen staff, I thought I was making a resource decision. I was actually making a knowledge decision, and I didn't know it, because I didn't know what the knowledge was or where it lived. I know now that knowledge can live in places that don't look like knowledge from the outside. It can live in a dishwasher's attention to the pattern on a plate. It can live in a kitchen log that nobody asked anyone to keep. And the cost of not knowing where the knowledge lives is that you fire the person who has it and spend 31 hours watching your son refuse to eat." I said, "You didn't know." He said, "I didn't look. Those are different things." He was right. Not knowing and not looking are different things. Not knowing is a gap you can close once you are willing to look. Not looking is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Marcus Hale had not been looking at his own household closely enough to know what it knew. The cost of that was 31 hours and a very frightened 7-year-old. The thing that closed the gap was not a consultant or a specialist or a new system. It was someone who had already been looking for 6 weeks without being asked, because looking was what the work required and he had decided to do the work all the way. I am telling you all of this because I think there is something in it that applies beyond kitchens and beyond children with autism and beyond the specific circumstances of one estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. I think there is a version of this story in most people's lives, a version where the knowledge you need is already present in a room you have not looked at carefully enough, where the person who has it is someone you have been looking through rather than at, where the cost of not looking is something you cannot fully calculate until the moment you have to. Pay attention to the people around you. Write down what you observe. Look at what you wrote. Let the pattern tell you something. It cost me nothing to keep that notebook except the time it took to write in it. It gave Noah a blueberry on day 22. It gave Sophia a summer of learning to cut apples the right way from a boy who remembers everything. It gave me a kitchen that is exactly the right size for the work I am supposed to be doing. I will take that. I will take all of it. Noah made his first scrambled eggs on a Saturday morning in October. He stood beside me at the stove, which required some adjustment because the stool was not the right height at the stove, and we had to find a step that worked. And he cracked 2 eggs into the pan the way I had shown him, gently, one at a time, checking for shell. He cooked them on low heat, stirring continuously, watching the texture change the way I had watched it change for a year, the way I had described it to him in the kitchen while he sat on his stool and listened. When they were done, he plated them himself. He placed them in the lower right of the plate, exactly where they had always gone. He stepped back and looked at the plate. He said, "They're right." "Yes." He said, "I made them right." I said, "You did." He carried the plate to the table and ate them. Then he came back to the kitchen and said, "Tomorrow I'm going to try again." I said, "I'll be here." He nodded. He went to find his father. That is where I will leave this story.